In this episode, we are moving into a part of risk management that often feels more real than the earlier discussion about identifying and analyzing risk, because now the question becomes what an organization actually chooses to do once a risk is understood. For a new learner, that is a major step, since many people assume security work ends once a problem has been found and described clearly. In practice, discovery is only the beginning. Leaders still have to decide whether to reduce the risk, live with the risk, change the business process around the risk, or take some other path that matches the organization's priorities and limits. That decision matters because no company has unlimited money, unlimited staff, or unlimited time, and not every risk deserves the same kind of response. Some risks need immediate action because the potential harm is too large or the weakness is too exposed. Others may be managed through smaller improvements, temporary safeguards, or a conscious decision to accept what remains. Understanding mitigation and acceptance strategies helps beginners see that good security management is not only about finding danger, but also about choosing a realistic and defensible response. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to begin is with the simple idea that risk response is about treatment, not just awareness. Once a risk has been identified and analyzed, the organization has to determine what it wants the future state to look like. That does not mean eliminating every possibility of harm, because that goal is rarely achievable and often not even sensible from a business perspective. Instead, leaders try to move risk into a range they can live with while still allowing the organization to function, grow, and serve its purpose. This is where mitigation and acceptance enter the conversation. Mitigation means taking action to reduce either the likelihood of the unwanted event, the impact if it occurs, or both at the same time. Acceptance means deciding that the remaining level of risk is tolerable and does not require further action right now beyond normal monitoring or awareness. Both are legitimate strategies, but they mean very different things. One changes the environment actively, while the other reflects a conscious judgment that additional action would not provide enough value compared with the cost, effort, or disruption involved. Risk mitigation is often the response that people picture first because it feels active and reassuring. If a weakness exists, the natural instinct is to improve a control, fix a process, strengthen oversight, or reduce exposure in some visible way. That instinct is often correct, especially when the risk is tied to important systems, sensitive data, or critical business operations. Mitigation can take many forms. It may involve technical improvements, stronger access restrictions, better monitoring, improved backup practices, clearer vendor oversight, tighter change management, or more disciplined user processes. For beginners, the key idea is that mitigation is not limited to buying a tool or adding a technical control. It includes any step that makes the risk less dangerous in practical terms. A good mitigation effort should be tied to the specific reason the risk matters. If the risk involves unauthorized access, then the chosen action should reduce access abuse meaningfully. If the concern is service disruption, then the chosen action should improve resilience, detection, or recovery instead of simply adding a control that looks impressive but does little to address the actual business problem. Mitigation strategies work best when they are proportionate to the nature of the risk and the environment in which the risk exists. That may sound obvious, but it is one of the most common places organizations go wrong. A team may overreact to a moderate issue by imposing a heavy control that slows the business unnecessarily, or underreact to a serious risk by choosing a cosmetic measure that creates the appearance of action without much real change. Good mitigation starts with asking what specifically is driving the risk. Is the problem weak identity control, inconsistent user behavior, poor system visibility, too much dependency on one vendor, limited recovery capability, or something else entirely? Once that is clear, the organization can choose a response that matches the real exposure instead of reaching automatically for the most familiar solution. Effective mitigation also considers side effects. A control that reduces one problem but creates major operational friction user workarounds, or new blind spots may not be a sound long-term choice. Mature security management always remembers that the goal is to improve the risk picture without quietly damaging the business in other important ways. One useful concept for beginners is the difference between inherent risk and residual risk, RR. Inherent risk is the level of risk that exists before controls are considered, while RR is what remains after safeguards, processes, and management actions have done their work. This matters because mitigation rarely brings risk to zero. Even after stronger controls are added, some uncertainty still remains. An attacker may still find a path, a user may still make a mistake, or a dependency may still fail at an unfortunate time. Good leaders understand that a mitigation strategy should be judged by how much meaningful reduction it creates, not by whether it claims perfection. That also means the organization should be honest about what remains once changes are implemented. If new monitoring improves visibility but does not remove the underlying exposure entirely, then the remaining risk still needs to be recognized and possibly accepted. This is a healthy way to think about security because it replaces fantasy with disciplined realism. The purpose of mitigation is to reduce risk to a more manageable level, then understand clearly what still exists after those improvements are in place. Another important idea is that mitigation can focus on prevention, detection, response, recovery, or some combination of those areas. Beginners sometimes assume the only worthwhile mitigation is prevention, but that is not always true. In some cases, preventing an event completely may be expensive, disruptive, or unrealistic, while improving detection and response may still reduce the organization's overall exposure in a meaningful way. For example, a company may not be able to remove every phishing attempt from employee inboxes, but it can improve awareness, tighten account protections, and strengthen detection so that the impact of a successful attack is reduced. Likewise, some continuity risks may never be prevented entirely, but improved backup, resilience, and recovery planning can lower the business damage when disruption happens. This broader view is useful because it helps security managers think beyond simple blocking. A strong mitigation strategy asks where in the life of the risk the organization can intervene most effectively. Sometimes the best answer is to stop the event from happening. Other times the smarter answer is to shorten the damage, speed the response, and make recovery more reliable. Risk acceptance is a very different strategy, and it is often misunderstood by new learners who hear the phrase and assume it means giving up or ignoring the problem. Real risk acceptance is not passive neglect. It is a documented and deliberate decision that the organization will live with a known level of risk because additional treatment is not justified at that moment. The justification might be financial, operational, strategic, or temporary. Perhaps the cost of reducing the risk further is too high relative to the likely benefit. Perhaps a system is nearing replacement, and leadership decides that a limited remaining period of exposure is acceptable with monitoring in place. Perhaps a control improvement would interfere so heavily with a critical business process that leaders choose to tolerate a moderate risk until a better option is available. None of that is careless if it is done consciously and with proper ownership. Acceptance becomes dangerous only when it is informal, invisible, or accidental. If people are accepting risk without naming it, discussing it, or documenting who approved it, then the organization is not managing risk well. It is simply drifting. For acceptance to be legitimate, the organization needs some idea of what level of risk is considered tolerable. That is often connected to the ideas of risk appetite and risk tolerance, even if those phrases are not always used in everyday conversation. Some organizations can absorb certain losses, delays, or exposures more easily than others depending on their size, industry, legal obligations, customer expectations, and reliance on critical systems. A startup experimenting in a fast-moving market may accept some kinds of uncertainty that a hospital, a bank, or a public utility would treat as completely unacceptable. That does not mean one organization is wise and the other is reckless. It means the business context shapes what can reasonably be lived with. Security managers therefore need to understand not just the technical side of a risk, but also the business side of tolerability. A decision to accept risk should reflect the organization's actual capacity and obligations, not just the convenience of avoiding work. When that judgment is aligned to business reality, Acceptance becomes a rational management choice rather than a hidden shortcut. A sound acceptance decision usually includes several elements, even when the process is not heavily formalized. The risk should be described clearly enough that decision makers understand what could happen, what assets or processes are affected, and what conditions make the issue relevant. The current control environment should be understood, including any partial mitigations already in place. The likely consequence of doing nothing more should be discussed honestly, along with the reasons further action is not being taken now. Most importantly, the decision should belong to the right owner. Security teams can advise, but they should not quietly accept business risk on behalf of leaders who own the process, the asset, or the consequence. This is a very important lesson for beginners because it highlights the difference between advising and owning. Security professionals help interpret the exposure, explain the options, and challenge weak reasoning when needed, but acceptance should be approved by someone with authority over the affected area and accountability for the outcome. That keeps the decision visible, accountable, and appropriately tied to business ownership. Time is another important factor because many acceptance decisions should not last forever. A risk may be accepted today because of budget limits, staffing constraints, competing projects, or an upcoming system replacement, but those conditions may change. What seemed reasonable 6 months ago may become much less defensible after business growth, a new customer requirement, a shift in attacker behavior, or a change in system importance. That is why mature organizations review accepted risks periodically instead of treating them as permanent truths. A temporary compensating control, TCC, may also be used while a more complete fix is delayed, which can make acceptance more responsible by reducing exposure during the waiting period. The main point is that acceptance should be revisited, not forgotten. A review cycle helps the organization ask whether the reasons for acceptance still hold, whether the business environment has changed, and whether the remaining risk has become more significant than it first appeared. Without that discipline, accepted risks can pile up quietly and create a much weaker posture than leadership ever intended. One of the most practical skills in this area is learning how to compare the cost of mitigation against the value of the reduction it produces. This does not require perfect mathematics, but it does require honest reasoning. If a risk is moderate, rarely exposed, and attached to a low-value asset, a very expensive mitigation may not be sensible even if it would reduce the risk further. On the other hand, if a relatively modest improvement would materially reduce exposure around a critical process, then delaying action may be far harder to justify. Good managers think about direct costs, ongoing support, user friction, change effort, and operational impact, not just the purchase price of a control. They also think about whether the chosen mitigation addresses the root issue or only one visible symptom. A weak decision process often swings between extremes, either approving expensive controls because the topic feels urgent or accepting too much risk because every improvement appears inconvenient in the short term. Strong decision makers look for proportional response. They want enough action to reduce meaningful exposure without pretending every risk deserves the same level of investment or urgency. A simple example can help show the difference between mitigation and acceptance in practice. Imagine a company that relies heavily on remote access for employees, contractors, and vendors. During a review, the security team finds that access reviews are inconsistent and that some accounts have broader permissions than necessary. Leadership now has choices. One path is mitigation, where the company improves periodic access review, tightens role definitions, reduces unnecessary privileges, and strengthens monitoring for unusual sign-in behavior. Another path could be partial acceptance, where leadership agrees that a small number of lower-risk legacy accounts will remain unchanged for a limited period because the supporting system will be retired soon, while the higher-risk accounts are remediated immediately. That combination is realistic because organizations often do not apply exactly one strategy across every part of a problem. The important thing is that the reasoning is clear. The business understands where action is being taken, where residual exposure remains, who approved the remaining risk, and when the accepted portion will be reviewed again. It is also important to recognize that mitigation and acceptance can be combined rather than treated as opposites that never meet. In fact, that is often how mature risk management works. An organization may mitigate a risk substantially, then accept the remaining RR because the leftover exposure falls within a range leadership can tolerate. For example, a company may improve email protections, strengthen identity controls, and expand user awareness to reduce phishing-related compromise, yet still accept that some chance of user error remains. That is not failure. It is reality. Good security management usually aims for reasonable reduction, not total elimination. This blended approach is especially useful because it reflects how real environments operate. Most risks are not solved once and forever. They are reduced through layers of control, then monitored and accepted at a level considered manageable given the organization's mission, obligations, and resources. When beginners understand this, risk response starts to feel much less like a dramatic all-or-nothing choice and much more like a steady discipline of reduction, judgment, ownership, and review. Communication matters greatly in both strategies because leaders, auditors, and business owners need to understand not just what was decided, but why it was decided. A weak mitigation proposal may list controls without explaining the business effect of the change. A weak acceptance decision may sound like convenience disguised as strategy. Strong communication avoids both problems by linking the response to the risk analysis that came before it. It explains what the issue is, what options were considered, what trade-offs were recognized, what level of exposure remains, and how the decision supports business reality. This matters because risk treatment is often reviewed later during audits, incidents, leadership transitions, or compliance questions. If the reasoning was vague at the time, it may be very hard to defend afterward. Clear communication also builds trust. Business leaders are more likely to support security decisions when they can see that the response was thoughtful, proportionate, and grounded in real operational understanding rather than in habit, fear, or purely technical preference. By the end of this discussion, the main idea should feel steady and practical. Risk mitigation is the set of actions an organization takes to reduce the likelihood or impact of a known risk, while risk acceptance is the conscious decision to live with a remaining level of exposure because further treatment is not justified at that time. Neither choice is automatically right or wrong on its own. The quality of the decision depends on context, ownership, proportionality, and review. Good mitigation targets the real driver of the risk and reduces exposure in a meaningful way without creating unnecessary damage elsewhere. Good acceptance is visible, deliberate, appropriately approved, and revisited when conditions change. For a new learner, this is one of the most important shifts in thinking about security management. The goal is not to react to every problem with the same answer. The goal is to choose the response that best fits the business, the risk, and the resources available, then make sure that choice is understood, supported, and monitored over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.